Once more, welcome to Insignia's final webinar of 2023. And in this session, as you know, we are going to take learnings from 2023's biggest crises and start to look at how we can apply those towards 2024 to make you more resilient as you head into the new year. So first of all, before I begin walking through some of those learnings, a quick introduction and I guess a bit of reflection as well. Clearly this time of year is a time for reflecting what we've achieved, what we've learned, what we're hoping to do next. So 2023 has been a very good year for me and Insignia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy that helps leaders around the world to do and say the right things on the most challenging days of their business lives. And this year we had the honor of being named as Consultancy of the Year for 2023 at the Continuity Insurance and Risk Awards. So that was a great start to the year. That was April, I think, that we were awarded that. But actually, what really matters to us at Insignia is this, our purpose. We believe that all organizations, excuse me, we believe all organizations should be ready to prevent or overcome crises so they can avoid the damage to lives, livelihoods, business and reputation caused by a mishandled crisis. So that's really our benchmark as to the degree to which 2023 has been successful. And I'm pleased to say that based on client feedback, this year we have made a difference. All of our clients either agreed or strongly agreed that they were better prepared for crisis as a result of working with us. But given that one of our values is what else, what next, what more, we're never satisfied. We're always looking to make ourselves better as an organization, but critically to take our clients nearer to being as perfectly prepared for a crisis as they possibly can be. So as you start to look back at your 2023, I had a couple of questions for you. So the first one is simply this: has your organization faced a significant crisis management challenge in 2023? And if you scan on that QR code, being Christmas time, those of you based in the UK will know that Christmas time is a time for pantomime, so we're looking for audience participation. If you can scan the QR code with your phone or join slido.com and enter that reference number, you will be able to cast your vote on this first poll. So if I can ask you all to do that, your own individual vote won't be visible, but please do go ahead and let us know whether you faced a significant crisis challenge in 2023. I'm just checking, is everybody able to access the poll? If you can, someone can just confirm in the chat pane that you are indeed able to vote. Can't see any votes coming in, so I'm just concerned you may not be able to vote. Could someone let me know whether or not you are able to vote, please? Catherine, can you maybe let me know from your side whether the poll is accessible? Okay, so it looks like the poll is live, and here we have the results. So the good news is that 3/4 of you did not face a significant crisis management challenge in 2023. In fact, now gone up to almost 4 out of 5. 1 in 5 of you did. And if there's a 1 in 5 chance of facing a significant crisis management challenge, clearly that is a good enough reason for doing what you clearly are doing by being on this call, which is to be prepared to respond as effectively as possible should that happen. Okay, so thank you. 1 in 5 of you has faced a significant crisis management challenge. 4 in 5 of you haven't. And by the way, I know there are 3 people who were due to be joining this call who are not joining the call because they're facing a significant crisis management challenge right now. So sadly, crises don't stop for Christmas. So I'm also interested in knowing, do you feel you are better prepared for crisis, less well prepared for crisis, or equally well prepared for crisis compared with 12 months ago? So if you can cast your vote against that question as well. I can see the votes coming in now, so that's great. I've got about 2/3 of your vote, so please keep on voting. Give you another minute and then we'll reveal the results. 10 seconds. Still time to get your vote in. Okay. So this is also good news. We have 2/3 of you who believe you are better prepared for crisis, 1/4 of you who are equally well prepared for crisis, and just a small proportion who are less well prepared for crisis. As I mentioned before, crisis management is certainly a game of continuous improvement. We can never be complacent. We can never rest on our laurels. There are always new challenges just around the corner, but I am delighted to see that 2/3 of you are better prepared and another 1/4, as I say, equally well prepared. So that is very good news. So on to the main business of this webinar. And this is a well-known phrase, never let a good crisis to waste. I said in the invitation, it is attributed to Winston Churchill, but there is debate around whether he actually said it. Whoever said it, it is certainly something to which I wholeheartedly subscribe. And so what we are going to do over the next 45 minutes or so is not learn from your own crises, although of course that is really important, that when you have an incident or indeed a near miss, you do act on the learnings from them. But it's also really valuable to learn from the experience of others. And a point I wanted to make very clear in this introduction is that what we're going to go through over the next 45 minutes or so is absolutely not pointing fingers at organizations that experienced a crisis and sometimes maybe didn't handle the crisis as well as they would like. The purpose of this session is to learn and to think about how situations like these could affect us and how we would respond to give us a better chance of doing so. I think one of the other things which is alluded to on this slide is that I know that sometimes when you're working in-house on crisis management or business resilience, it can sometimes be hard to get the attention of your leadership teams. And I found over the years that one very effective way of doing that is bringing to their attention crises from competitors or organizations with whom they can relate, because by bringing it closer to home, it makes it real and it can be a very effective way of getting your senior colleagues to engage with crisis management when maybe without that prompt and without that shiver going down their back of thinking that could have been us, it can be that much more difficult. So we've got almost 50 crisis management professionals on the line. Again, bit of audience participation time. What would you view as the year's most notable crises? This is going to generate a word cloud, so if you can just put some names or issues or risks into the Slido tool, and we'll see what you are seeing as some of the most notable crises of this year. I can see you're typing, that's great. I can see we're building up. Again, I'll give you another minute. There's 16 of you already contributed. I can see others are still typing. Still a couple of people typing, so 10 seconds and then we'll see what comes up. Okay. Yeah, okay. So there's no shortage of crises. So I'm just looking at how many we're going to cover, but certainly we're going to talk about the Nigel Farage spat. We're going to talk about government challenges. We're going to talk about cyber threats. We're going to talk about COVID. We're going to touch on Lineker. We're going to talk about the air traffic control outage. So with apologies, we're not going to cover everything, but I think, again, what this illustrates is that there are a lot of risks out there and there are a lot of pitfalls for, excuse me, organisations that are not well prepared. By the way, I do apologise for my sore throat. I'm into the third week of a cold, which just won't go away. So apologies if there's a little bit of spluttering going on. So, final question at this part of the webinar before I dive into some of the learnings. Did your organisation run a cyber exercise in 2023? Okay, so about 50-50 with a slight majority towards no, but fundamentally 50-50. Certainly what we found, and there we are, 50-50 as it stands, certainly we found that there was a wide range of topics that we ran exercises against. I think we're delivering our 28th and final simulation of the year on Tuesday, but probably actually reflecting this, a third to a half of those exercises were on cyber, and that's no surprise, and it's probably a very good idea, because one of the things we saw in 2023 that cyber attacks did continue to wreak havoc across multiple organizations, and again, one of the businesses that was due to be on this call and isn't is currently dealing with a cyber incident. And also these occurred throughout the year. I mean, if you look at the one on the left, that was Royal Mail on the 11th of January, who were affected by a cyber incident, right through to a week or so ago when news broke that Sellafield had been hacked by groups linked to Russia and China. This had been hacked in the past, but according to the media, that had been covered up. So what can we learn from these cyber attacks and others? Well, firstly, this is a real and present threat. There's research out recently from the ICO which said that looking at the public sector alone, there were 1,420 incidents of malware ransomware and phishing reported to them in the first 6 months of the year, compared with 855 incidents the previous year, 2022, so almost double. Now, clearly part of that may be that reporting is getting better, but I think it also reflects that attacks are becoming more common. I think one of the things that we're continuing to see is that there is a real challenge with communicating in a timely and effective and appropriate manner in the aftermath of a cyber incident. Royal Mail chose to stay quite tight-lipped about the situation. However, news of and indeed the words of the negotiation between their ransom negotiator and the cyber criminals were printed in full in the media. Those emails, those conversations were themselves leaked. So communicating and staying ahead of the communication curve remains a challenge in the event of cyber incidents. The Sellafield one is interesting because I think there is now increasing, if not widespread, recognition that cyber attacks are not just about online businesses, banks or retailers, excuse me, but increasingly infrastructure and operationally focused businesses are in the cyber attackers' sights. In fact, there's an argument to say that they are a more lucrative target for the attackers because they know that if a factory can be brought grinding to a halt or a power station, there's a heavy weight on the people responsible for that facility to pay a ransom and get it going again because of the criticality of what the particular piece of infrastructure or manufacturing does. I'm going to touch on this in more detail later on, but the Sellafield one, which talks about cover-up, this talks to the importance of having a crisis-resistant culture and early warning signs of a potential crisis. And I will come back to that later on in the webinar. I wanted to take a slightly deeper dive on one of the cyber incidents from earlier in the year, April, which was Capita. Capita came out on, I think, originally the 16th of April to say that there had been a cyber incident, but that they believed there was no evidence of customer, supplier, or colleague data having been compromised. Once more, the media got a different story. The Sunday Times on the 16th of April alleged that the hackers had posted to the dark web information including people's phone numbers, home addresses, and details of more than 100 bank accounts. And ultimately, clearly, it became clear that it was a cyber attack, and Capita were explicit in saying so. Learnings from this: once again, you need to think in advance about how and when you are going to communicate. Have some in-principle messages and statements prepared, get them reviewed by your lawyers, and scenario plan how you would respond in the event of you being attacked. And when you do that scenario planning, involve a wide constituency of people within your organization. One of the problems in a cyber attack can be a bit of a silo mentality or a lack of understanding between the leadership of the organization, the tech teams, the communication teams, and the lawyers and other parts of the business as well. Scenario planning together how you would respond to a cyber attack and what the ramifications of decisions that leaders make as it relates to the technology, for example, is really helpful to avoid wasting time during a crisis, making wrong calls, or being too slow to communicate in a crisis. So think beforehand about how you will communicate in a crisis, and also scenario planning beforehand, how you will make decisions and what in principle decisions you will make. One of the most obvious ones is, what is our policy on paying ransoms? Having an understanding of what that is before the event avoids having very long, complex, high-stakes conversations when the event happens. The other thing that I wanted to draw out of the Capita case is, the thing that we as crisis management professionals are seeking to avoid, which is simply that crises have significant impact, and by planning, training and rehearsing well ahead of time, and then with as near as possible a pitch perfect response when the crisis happens, we can avoid or reduce the financial impact of a crisis on a business. This is the value of Capita in terms of its share price versus the FTSE 250, of which it is a member, from the moment that the cyber breach was announced to earlier this week. But it's not even just the financial impact, it's also the human impact. And as was the case, or has been the case in many crises, the Capita CEO, who was the CEO at the time of the breach, is no longer the CEO. There was talk of him retiring anyway, but I think what happened clearly didn't help. And sadder still, that's one job potentially that's gone. There are 900 jobs. People have been made redundant by Capita, partly as a result of the impact of the cyber attack. So the message here really is, what we do as resilience, communication and crisis management professionals isn't just about protecting our organization's financial standing, but it's also about protecting the people who work for the organization, the people who buy your products or services, the people who invest in your business. So there's a real human cost when crisis management goes wrong. So, next bit of audience participation. Did your organization run a reputational crisis exercise in 2023? And by that, I mean one focused, for example, on leadership behavior or focused on cultural matters. Did you run an exercise specifically focused on a reputational, a serious reputational issue? Okay, I think we are almost there. Okay, so it was 50-50 on running a cyber exercise. It's kind of near enough 60-40. There, it's getting nearer to 60-40 on not running a reputational crisis exercise. I think it's quite interesting that 40%, 41% did run an exercise focused on reputation. Again, that's something we've been seeing this year, that more and more organizations are seeing the value in running an exercise based not on a business interruption, but on something that you might describe as softer, but actually which can have just as big an impact, if not a bigger impact. And those that don't, our view would be you leave yourselves vulnerable to one of the most serious risks of all, because what is certainly true is that many organizations in 2023 were challenged by reputational risk. Here's a few examples here. Often focused on leadership or culture or behaviors or values. And this isn't even all of the examples. BP obviously lost its CEO Bernard Looney over allegations of inappropriate behaviour and not being upfront about that, about the relationships that he had had with colleagues. And I noticed yesterday he lost 32 million in terms of share options and bonuses as a result of the investigation into his original suspension and ultimately departure as CEO. So these kinds of reputational, leadership, behavioural, cultural issues are far more prevalent than before, and they are in many ways harder for organisations to get a grip on, because I always think it's easier for people to plan for events that come from outside, which are not their fault or not their responsibility really, whereas reputational risk is often caused by what people within the organisation, often the leaders themselves, do or don't do. So they are harder to contemplate, harder to plan for, harder to rehearse for. So how can we avoid these kinds of situations happening within our organisation? Well, as I've alluded to already, it begins with leadership, governance and action. Leaders who are courageous and brave enough to do and say the right things. Leaders who are prepared to take action when the standards and the values of the business have been contravened, and to make tough decisions about those things. Really, your values are not about what you say they are, but they're about what you actually do. And if you tolerate behaviours which are not in line with your values, then that is a sure sign that a potential reputational crisis could be on the way. It's also about leaders creating an environment of psychological safety. In other words, where anybody in the organisation feels that they are able to raise concerns about behaviours or the culture within the organisation be listened to, and if their concerns prove to be well-founded, that those concerns will be acted upon. So psychological safety is a really important part of creating a crisis-resistant culture. Being mindful of the incentives and targets that are set for individuals within organisations. This is a different kind of crisis, but if people are targeted, for example, purely on sales, they may take shortcuts around the proper procedures to achieve those sales, causing the potential for dishonesty or the kind of behaviours that would result in a significant reputational crisis. It's also important that however important you are, however superb someone is at their job, that they are not untouchable. A crisis-resistant culture means that everybody has to toe the line in terms of values and ways of working. When planning for reputational risk, it does require a willingness to think and plan for the unthinkable. You know, when we get a client who says, we'd like to run an exercise about one of the directors going rogue and committing fraud or whatever it might be, that is the sign of an organisation which is prepared to think the worst. It's not because they think they do have bad apples, but it's because they know they can never be certain that a situation of that kind won't happen in future. So it's a grown-up and an appropriate mindset if you want to avoid situations of this kind. I think it's also important for leaders to constantly reevaluate the context and the world in which they are operating. What was okay yesterday, last year, 5 years, 10 years ago is not okay today. So the ability to lift your heads up, to look at the outside world and understand that we need to change the way that we behave to line up with the outside world, not expect the outside world still to tolerate us, is really critical. So identify your reputational risks, think the unthinkable, make sure that they are planned for. A couple of specific examples of reputational risk. Many of you will remember this from the Women's World Cup back in the summer. Luis Rubiales, and an image that has been seen by millions of people around the world, and that stimulated a crisis which played out over a number of weeks, including his mother locking herself in a church and going on hunger strike. I'm sure you all remember this situation. Could I ask you in the chat box just to type up what you think the Spanish Football Federation's values might be? Just have a guess as to what the Spanish Football Association's values might be. So if you can find that chat box. So any guesses? Catherine, if you're seeing them, let me know. I'm not seeing them currently. Look in the question pane, says Catherine. There we go. Okay. Okay. Sue says fairness, equality, trust. Daniel says integrity, honesty, equality. Kirsten, fairness, equality. So you have got very close. And Tom, that the women's game is inferior to the men's in Spain. Lorna, equality, integrity, fair. So their actual values are integrity, transparency, and respect. So the reason that I mention that, and certainly Tom's would have been a more authentic set of values, is that what we know is that the biggest harm to reputation is caused when an organization operates or responds to a crisis in a way which runs counter to its values. It demonstrates that they are not their values at all. So this was a very good or bad example of an organization behaving in a way which was completely counter to its values and causing itself significant harm as a result. Another organization which almost throughout 2023 grappled with reputational risk caused by allegations of behaviours which were not acceptable was the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI, representing Britain's biggest businesses. And again, the big point I want to make here is that it is definitively highly risky to not plan for and do everything in your power to prevent reputational risks emerging. Why? Well, because of all of the things that you can see on this screen. Reputational risks in particular can escalate and spiral out of control very, very quickly. And if you look at the challenges that the CBI had to face, the suspension of all of its external events for 4 months, members leaving in their droves, Aviva, KPMG, NatWest and Tesco ceasing to be members, and therefore the loss of fee income that came with that and the refinancing that was required as a result. The fact that government no longer wanted to engage with the CBI. Sadly, the fact that 100 people were made redundant because of the loss in revenue and the loss of members and the reinvention of the organisation. Ultimately, this was, and I think to some extent still is, an organisation facing an existential threat. And I think the evidence would suggest that those existential threats are more likely to be caused by a reputational crisis than a traditional business interruption or event-based crisis. One sidebar on the CBI situation is, I don't know if you recall when the CEO was first ousted, Tony Danker. One of the things he did within 48 hours of being ousted was to be interviewed by the BBC, putting his side of the story. And he actually made the situation for the CBI worse by doing that. The reason I mention that is, again, to emphasize that thinking through your communication, if at all possible, setting the communication agenda rather than letting your critics do that for you is almost always the best thing to do. What I'd also remark on is the piece on the left-hand side of the screen, the disproportionate scrutiny that a crisis brings. Crises do bring incredible scrutiny, and once you're in the media's spotlight, and indeed the spotlight of other stakeholders, it's very hard to get out, which once again just makes it so important to try to avoid getting in the spotlight in the first place, and if you do end up in the spotlight, doing and saying the right things as quickly as possible to avoid the crisis lingering on for days, weeks, or even months, as is the case with the CBI. Talking about communication, one organisation which I think communicated very proactively during a crisis, and they were mentioned on the word cloud earlier on, was National Air Traffic Control. You will recall that back in August, there was disruption to their systems, which meant that many flights couldn't take off or land. And clearly it had a massive impact on a whole load of people. But what NATS did well was it got out there and it communicated quickly and it communicated prolifically. This is the Chief Operating Officer that at the end of the first day, 7:30 in the evening, did a video message. All of the right messages, you can see the word apologise. Those were her first words, and then talked about what had happened, how they'd addressed it, and what they were going to do next. From a pure statement point of view, within 2 hours, they had issued 3 statements. It's still the case that sometimes organisations find it hard to communicate at all on the first day. So be ready to communicate quickly. It doesn't mean that you have to, but have a process for approval and issuing statements in place and an expectation of how long that will take, who needs to be involved in it, and an understanding around how you will get those messages out. These went out fundamentally via NAT's own website, and the media picked them up from there. NAT's communication wasn't perfect. Interestingly, they weren't the very first organisation to state that there were issues with air traffic control. The airline Loganair beat them to the punch by about 20 or 30 minutes. Again, that's not ideal. If it's your crisis, and it's happening publicly outside in the wider world, you really want to be the main and ideally first commentator on that situation. But without one slight slip up, I think Nat's rescued the situation well and seized the communication agenda. If you do have questions, by the way, please do post them within the question pane, and we will get to as many of those as possible. Leadership. Leadership in a crisis, we know, is critical. So compared with 12 months ago, is your leadership team more engaged with business resilience, less engaged, or equally engaged? Okay, so we have 13% who are less engaged, which is a real shame. And we have 42% equally and 46% more engaged. So again, I'm pleased to see that the winner on this poll is more engaged with business resilience. Again, that's something we're seeing, that it is less hard to get CEOs and leadership teams to attend simulations. I think there's a greater recognition that bad things can and do happen, and that they are ultimately responsible for protecting their organisation. So I wanted to look at 2 or 3 situations which involved leaders and what we can learn from those. So first of all, Birmingham City Council, which, as many of you will know, is effectively bankrupt. And I think one of the interesting things from the investigation, the initial investigation that's just come out, is that their view is that the culture of the organisation set by the leaders at the organisation, actually, sorry, I think I've missed a slide. Here we go, yeah. The first thing that went wrong, or one of the key things that went wrong early on, was that the council leader wasn't in Birmingham when the announcement was made that the council was bankrupt. Now, in a crisis, leaders need to lead, and they need to visibly lead. It was the guy's 50th birthday. Understandably, he'd had his trip to New York planned for years, but it was a misstep at a time when the leader needs to be front and center to be somewhere else in the world. Another organization which had a similar situation in terms of the role of the CEO was Norfolk Southern, the US-based train company, had a major accident in Ohio with massive environmental damage, but the CEO chose not to appear at the town hall meeting to talk to the townspeople who'd been affected by this awful crash. Now, you only get one chance to make a first impression, and whilst both of these leaders subsequently apologized and expressed their concern and commitment, it's kind of too late. We used to talk about the golden hour, didn't we, in crisis management, and what the things you do and say first have the most powerful impact. So think about how your leaders should be deployed in a crisis. Make sure they are exemplifying the values and the messages that you want them to exemplify. And now for the slide which I sneak previewed a couple of minutes ago. continuing with Birmingham, there has been an initial investigation into the bankruptcy, and one of the things that initial investigation has come up with in its report was that it was the culture which was the cause of many of the problems that subsequently occurred. The things that they identified, and we're talking about Birmingham City Council here, but think about how this might relate to your organisation and how we can avoid these syndromes happening, because they are all factors which will make a crisis more likely. So, low levels of trust internally, a tendency to try to minimise bad news, people working in silos rather than one big organisation, a defensive culture, one in which there was difficulty in speaking up about bad news, optimism bias, promising things that could not be delivered, and a deep-seated blame culture. These, as I say, are all characteristics which are not unique to Birmingham City Council, but all of which will definitively increase the possibility of a crisis occurring. So work hard on getting the culture of the organisation right. Another critical thing that leaders are responsible for as it relates to crisis management, in addition to culture, is decision making. And of course, 2023 in the UK saw the ongoing COVID inquiry, and I was particularly interested in its examination of the decision making. And some of the questioning there and some of the commentary around that, I think, again, provide real learnings for other organisations and their leaders under pressure in crisis. One of the things that came out was that, number one, experts advising government had underestimated how fast the virus was spreading and overestimated the extent to which it could be controlled. In a crisis, there is a tendency to hope for the best. I would suggest that your leaders and your crisis management teams should be planning for the worst rather than simply hoping for the best. Secondly, embracing diversity and contrary views within your crisis management team. The inquiry revealed how SAGE, that was the scientific committee, was dominated by infectious disease experts, and they all brought a similar frame of reference to the situation. It's not to say that their views were not important, but people with different perspectives need to be represented. So beware groupthink within your crisis management teams, and indeed, good practice is to actually appoint devil's advocates who are really there to provide challenge and a contrary view to the prevailing wisdom. The third thing, the inquiry commented that the commitment to be led by the science actually meant that too much focus was put on the advisors. One of my mantras is advisors advise and leaders decide. Take advice, but ultimately the leader needs to make the decision. And something that I'm very passionate about is setting strategic intent. At the inquiry, Sir Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, said he was never entirely clear on what the actual aim of government was. Beware that trap in a crisis. We talk all the time about setting strategic intent at the start of a crisis. By knowing what success looks like, it enables you to align the team around that and to make decisions based on what is most likely to achieve that strategic intent. The final crisis that I wanted to take a look at was one that again was mentioned in the word cloud, which was the Alison Rose, NatWest, Nigel Farage affair, in which Nigel Farage was debanked, either as a result of his political views or as a result of not having enough money to qualify for the Coutts account. I guess the headline says it all here, that in crisis management, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. This was a crisis which kind of got away from NatWest and morphed and escalated and twisted and turned and stayed in the headlines for many weeks. And as a result of what happened, you know, NatWest lost its CEO, Coutts lost its CEO. So what are the learnings from this crisis, and how can we apply them to our organizations? Well, as a very simple mantra, it's important that you manage the crisis or it will manage you. Nigel Farage drove this story, drove this crisis, and throughout that time, it appeared that the organisation in question was following rather than shaping and leading. And I think that also comes back to what you do before the crisis emerges, particularly where this crisis was, the catalyst for this crisis was a decision that NatWest itself made, properly and robustly scenario plan what might happen next, so that you are ready to preempt them, head it off, or be ready to respond should the scenario play out in an unhelpful manner. It didn't feel as though NatWest had predicted or understood what Nigel Farage might do as a result of their decision. Third thing again comes back to communication. Firstly, getting the message straight. There were two messages around why Nigel Farage had lost his bank account. One, as I say, was because he was someone that they didn't want to be a customer because of his views, and one was because he didn't qualify for the bank account in question. Be clear on what the message is. Be clear on what your message is. Another important learning to be reinforced is be careful what you say to journalists. Alison Rose was caught out by saying something to a BBC journalist which turned out not to be wholly true, and that was then used against her. And I think it comes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. This is a case whereby a self-inflicted crisis is often the most damaging of all. So we're into the final 5 minutes of the webinar. So compared with 12 months ago, does your organization face a less challenging risk landscape, an equally challenging risk landscape, or a more challenging risk landscape? We've got to the end of 2023 almost. What do we think? Are we in a riskier place, pretty much the same, or a less risky place, particularly as we look forward to 2024? Yep, again, that would be my perception, that it's increasingly challenging. We're in this VUCA world. It's very volatile out there. There are more risks to be faced up to. And talking about more risks, let's quickly do another word cloud. What risks are you most concerned about in 2024? Okay, let's see what we've got. So cyber's not going away. Climate is something certainly we're hearing clients being concerned about. Environmental risks, political instability, power outages. Yeah, there's others related to cyber, geopolitical, war and conflicts, war conflict, cyber attack. So there is plenty of work for us as crisis management and resilience professionals still to be doing. And as people have mentioned here, there are elections in many parts of the world, not least US, UK and India. So there is much for us to focus on. One more word cloud, and then I'm going to do a final slide and let you go. And for you as individuals, what are the biggest challenges facing professionals working in crisis management in 2024, do you think? What are you personally feeling challenged by, or will be your biggest challenges next year? So, getting people's engagement, exco complacency, workload, yeah. Getting to grips with so many huge issues. Budget, yes. Leader fatigue. So there are risks for us, lack of resource. There are many risks for us and our organisations to address, but there are challenges that we will be facing. And I think the more we can do to support each other, the better. These webinars will be continuing next year. We will be having our September conference again, and there are a number of really good forums, both physical and virtual, where people working in this area, I think, can share ideas and share support. So big challenges for us, big opportunities though, given the more risky external perspective. And the good news is that we did see in the earlier slide that leaders are more engaged with this area. So I want to, and apologies, we're just overrunning by 1 or 2 minutes. I wanted to give you 5 New Year's resolutions for you to think about. Maybe pick one that works for you or one of your own. Let's commit to action on the back of this webinar. Champion a crisis-resistant culture. What can we do to create the environment in which crises are less likely within our organisation? To make sure that our crisis management plans are risk agnostic, given the breadth of things that we saw on the previous but one slide, given the fact that it is a highly volatile world, and given the fact we can't predict everything, how can we make sure that our plans are geared up to help us whatever the crisis might be? Scenario planning at every stage. A number of the situations that we looked at over the last 45 minutes could have been responded to better if scenario planning had happened either before the events and we'd worked out how would we respond to a cyber attack, or during the crisis itself. If we're going to stop this person having a bank account, what might happen next and how can we address that? Practice, practice, practice. It was good to see that many of you have been running cyber and reputational exercises. I still believe that rehearsals and exercises are the most important predictor of how well an organisation will respond to a crisis. And act on learnings. You know, hopefully there are learnings from today's webinar that you can act on. Make sure you act on the learnings from within your own organisation. And I do think, again, on the previous slide, there was something about engaging leaders. Look for those examples within your own sector or those that you know will resonate most with your leaders, and bring those to their attention. In summarising, if you want to assess how prepared your business is to respond to a crisis, please take our crisis readiness test. There will be a link to that on the follow-up email. And given that it's Christmas, and I'm sure many of you are struggling to think of some good presents, we're once again giving away 3 copies of my book, Crisis Proof. You just need to reply to the email that will be coming out to you in the next 24 hours saying you'd like to be in the draw for that book, and you will receive one. With apologies, I have overrun, so I'm not going to take questions today. But if you have any questions or would like assistance with anything, whether it's about today or more broadly about your crisis planning or training, I'd be delighted to assist. If you want to drop me a line or give me a call via any of these channels. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to many of you who've been on most of this year's webinars. I'm delighted to hear from the earlier polls that you've made good progress in terms of making your business more resilient, more prepared than it was at the start of the year. I hope we've played a very small part in doing that. I do genuinely wish you a peaceful, relaxing and enjoyable festive season. I do hope a crisis doesn't emerge on Christmas Eve. Do make those New Year's resolutions, those commitments to make your organisation more resilient. And with that, we'll bring the webinar to a close. Have a crisis-free afternoon and indeed a crisis-free seasonal period. Thank you, everyone.